Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story. Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, our story follows Frank Balistrieri, the man who ruled Milwaukee's underworld with quiet precision and sharp intelligence. Before we begin, like this video, we're aiming for 100 likes in this video. It truly helps us keep these powerful stories alive. Share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support motivates us to bring you even more fascinating stories from the underworld. Now, settle in and let the story of Frank Balistrieri guide you into the night. He was born in 1918 in Milwaukee's Italian enclave near the Old Third Ward, where surnames from Sicily filled parish rolls, and the smell of bread drifted out of corner bakeries. The neighborhood was a web of family loyalty, church festivals, and social clubs that doubled as switching stations for influence. Prohibition had already shown the city how quickly opportunity could turn illicit. Older men had made fortunes running liquor, and even after the ban on alcohol ended, the machinery of vice didn't simply shut down, it adapted. In that environment, a young man learned early that money has roots, and those roots can be mapped and guarded. As he grew, Frank understood that combining polish with force presented discreetly could move mountains. He watched older operators collect from bookmakers, arrange protection, and steer business to favored vendors. He studied their manner. The pause before a promise, the raised eyebrow that signaled a decision. He married into the Aliotto family, a respected clan within the same community. His wife Antoinette was the daughter of John Aliotto, who would become the acknowledged Milwaukee boss in the 1950 seconds. That marriage mattered. In these circles, family ties were not just social bonds, they were cables that pulled someone closer to the center. Frank cultivated a public image of a businessman who knew how to run restaurants, hotels, and service companies. He liked proper attire and measured words. He avoided street-level scenes, preferring offices and dining rooms. Behind that presentation, he learned the inner workings of illegal gambling numbers, sports betting, card games, and the way cash flowed from taverns and clubs through pinball routes, jukeboxes, and cigarette machines. Coin-operated machines might sound harmless, but in mid-century Milwaukee, they were an engine of cash and influence. If you controlled which machines sat in which bars, you influenced more than music. You set the rhythm for debts and favors. By the late 1950 seconds, as federal heat rose on national figures, Milwaukee's organization looked inward for steady hands that wouldn't bring loud headlines. John Aliotto embodied a cautious approach. When Aliotto stepped back in the early 1960 seconds, insiders and law enforcement alike concluded that Frank, now the son-in-law and trusted strategist, took the reins. He did not hold press conferences or issue proclamations. The sign was subtler. People deferred to him. Meetings shifted to rooms he preferred. Decisions waited until he had weighed in. The FBI would later write his name at the top of Milwaukee charts. He consolidated gambling operations across the city. Bookmakers paid for protection and organization. Dice and card games that had once moved from basement to basement found steadier footing under a coordinated umbrella. He settled disputes among his people swiftly and privately, an approach that kept police and newspapers at arm's length. He also sought control over vending and amusement routes. Tavern owners learned that contracts for jukeboxes or pinball machines tended to favor companies aligned with his circle. Competitors who tried to muscle in often encountered pressure, sometimes legal, sometimes not. The aim was not spectacle, but compliance. There were violent incidents in Milwaukee during that era, including bombings tied by investigators to conflicts over machine routes and bar territory. Reporters and police long suspected organized crime factions were behind several explosions that damaged property and sent unmistakable messages. Frank was widely regarded by authorities as the central figure in the city's underworld at the time. He denied wrongdoing, and it bears noting he was not convicted in connection with those bombings. What is clear from court records and surveillance reports is that he insisted on dominance in gambling and vending, and rivals paid a price for resisting, whether through economic squeeze, intimidation, or legal maneuvers used as leverage. Frank's style set him apart. Where flashier bosses chased headlines and nightclubs, he cultivated precision. Meetings happened in quiet corners of restaurants, in hotel suites, or in offices connected to legitimate concerns. He listened more than he spoke, but when he issued directions, they resonated. Loyalty was rewarded. Disloyalty, even casual indiscipline, was corrected. He insisted his people keep themselves tidy, keep their cars registered, keep their names out of gossip columns. He liked the order of a ledger balanced to the penny. That taste for control extended to his relationships with other Midwestern powers, most notably the Chicago outfit, whose reach touched Milwaukee historically. Tribute moved south, understanding flowed north. The tie benefited him, offering backing when disputes required weight beyond city limits. His household reflected the duality of his world. On the one hand, family dinners, church attendance, community charities. On the other, careful coaching of sons who grew up to practice law, offering the family a veneer of professional respectability and, at times, a useful shield. Years later, those same sons would face federal charges in cases tied to their father's realm, but in the 1,960 seconds that future was still forming. For the moment, Frank had shaped a system that united gambling, loans, and vending across much of the city, pushing revenue streams toward him and his allies. Law enforcement paid attention. The FBI assigned agents, built charts, and cultivated informants. Surveillance teams learned his schedule and took notes on who went in and out of his preferred venues. Wiretaps and hidden microphones appeared. Federal affidavits from the period, later made public, describe a chess game. Frank shifted meeting sites, raised background noise, and preferred walk and talks in parking lots. Agents refined their bugging techniques, waited, and recorded. The resulting tapes, particularly from the 1,970 seconds, became crucial in later prosecutions. They offered a portrait of a man who spoke in careful codes, yet still directed extortion schemes and gambling operations with unmistakable authority. Extortion was central to his business model as described in indictments and trial records. The pattern repeated across industries he touched. Tavern owners or distributors were pressed subtly or bluntly to accept contract terms that benefited companies aligned with him. Those who hesitated reported threats, business disruptions, or inspections that arrived at just the wrong moment. Courts later concluded that these tactics crossed the line into criminal extortion under federal law. Still, during the early phase of his reign, he often kept those lines blurred enough to avoid immediate convictions, which increased his reputation as a careful operator. Gambling remained a steady earner. Numbers betting in Milwaukee had deep roots, and sports wagering brought in consistent cash. Coordinating bookmakers required trust and discipline. Collections had to be reliable. Disputes among bettors needed fast arbitration. Loan sharking provided another pillar. People who got in over their heads were offered credit at rates that guaranteed dependence. Late payments brought pressure, again described in later cases as criminal coercion. Frank did not need to be present when a debt collector visited. His authority hung over the exchange like a signature on a letterhead. Beyond the city, Las Vegas glittered. By the late 1,960 seconds and early 1,970 seconds, Midwestern organized crime groups had a hand in casino financing and operations through complex corporate fronts and Teamsters-backed loans. Milwaukee's seat at that table ran through Frank and his ties with Chicago and other Midwest families. Federal investigations later established that Midwestern bosses participated in skimming schemes, diverting unreported cash from casino counting rooms before it reached the books. Prosecutors would go on to prove those schemes in court against several figures across the region. Frank's name would appear in those cases too, with plea agreements and convictions linking him to the illegal diversion of casino revenue. But that phase belongs a bit later in his timeline. In the 1,960 seconds, the foundation was being laid. Alliances formed, channels tested, signals passed through trusted couriers. Not every bit of his influence came from fear. He could be generous in ways that produced loyalty, a favor at City Hall, a well-timed loan, a recommendation to a bank manager who valued certain customers. He employed people. He steered construction work to friendly firms. He was present at weddings and funerals, often quietly but unmistakably. For many in the neighborhood, he represented stability, Someone who knew how to get things done when official routes bogged down. That blend of intimidation and patronage kept his network intact, even as federal attention intensified. By the end of the decade, local police and federal agents saw the same outline. A boss who rarely raised his voice, yet had consolidated illegal gambling, dominated vending routes through coercion, and maintained working relationships with larger syndicate figures. The nickname Mr. Big, used by the FBI, stuck not because he flaunted power, but because he exercised it without needing to explain himself. Court filings from years later would spell out specific episodes, contracts forced on business owners, payments delivered on schedule, coded conversations that aligned with acts of intimidation, and juries would agree with prosecutors in key cases. At this stage, though, he was still the man in the well-tailored suit, taking a table in the corner, nodding once, and leaving before dessert. Meanwhile, the climate began to change. Congress hardened laws against organized crime. Federal prosecutors brought racketeering tools that let them tell bigger stories to juries, connecting extortion, gambling, and interstate business. The Bureau refined its electronics and increased pressure on peripheral figures who might flip. Newspaper reporters sharpened their focus on Milwaukee's hidden economy. And Frank, who had spent years avoiding unnecessary attention, found his name appearing more often in print. He stuck to his routines, but the net, slowly, was drawing closer. He responded with the same qualities that had lifted him: caution, discipline, and demands for loyalty. He rotated meeting spots. He reminded lieutenants to keep their voices low and their tempers lower. He widened his legitimate front hotels, restaurants, vending concerns with proper licenses, and used lawyers to contest searches and subpoenas. Yet the structure of his power made new conflicts inevitable. Rivals, whether independent operators in Wisconsin or assertive figures from other cities, pressed for a slice of revenue. Taverns changed hands. Distributors tested the waters of independence. Each test required a reply, and each reply generated risk. A conversation that might be overheard, a delivery that could be traced, a contract that, under a prosecutor's microscope, looked less like negotiation and more like a shakedown. Through it all, Frank held to his belief that order could be imposed, that tribute would continue, and that the city's pulse would sync to the schedule he set. In rooms with thick drapes and steady lamps, he weighed new opportunities, including more serious involvement in Las Vegas financing channels against the mounting pressure at home. What he could not see, not fully, was how much the microphones would capture, and how those recordings would later strip the polish from his public image, and present, in a judge's courtroom, the voice of a boss running extortion, gambling, and related schemes. By the early 1970 seconds, the stage was set for a shift from quiet dominance to legal reckoning. The FBI had tapes. Prosecutors had patterns they could explain to juries. Competing families across the Midwest were deepening their involvement in Nevada, a development that would tie Frank's name to casino cash in ways that went far beyond rumor. His sons, trained as lawyers, began to appear more often around their father's business affairs, a fact that would matter greatly in the years to come. For now, though, the city still bowed, the roots still paid, and Mr. Minia's in Lee.com. Big still walked out of restaurants with his cufflinks shining, convinced that the order he had created would hold. The decade changed the light in Milwaukee. Neon still hummed above tavern doors, but the rooms where choices were made grew quieter, more controlled, stripped of casual chatter. Frank kept the same deliberate posture at lunch tables and curbside meetings, but pressure mounted in places he couldn't ignore. Agents learned his routes. They waited across the street from a favorite restaurant. They counted cars in the lot at a small office, and they mapped the pattern of visitors who came in carrying nothing and left with folders tucked flat under a jacket. Those observers were patient and professional, and the recorders they planted in the late 1960 seconds and early 1970 seconds rewarded that patience. The tapes didn't explode with fireworks. They captured something subtler: a seasoned boss setting prices, directing subordinates, and affirming a system built on illegal gambling, high-interest loans, and control of coin-operated machines in bars across the city. Behind that calm delivery was a calibrated message. Bookmakers operated under his umbrella and paid for the privilege. Collections were organized, disputes were handled quickly, Numbers betting ticked along day after day. In taverns, the glow of a jukebox wasn't just about music. Routes were currency. If a bar wanted certain machines, contracts tended to run through firms aligned with Frank's circle. The terms favored his side. Those who resisted found their deliveries delayed, their patrons nudged elsewhere, or their licenses inspected at delicate moments. The aim was not to create noise. The aim was obedience. That structure produced steady revenue and gave him leverage over neighborhood businesses that needed predictable foot traffic and avoided trouble by design. Links to larger forces deepened. Milwaukee's crew historically interacted with Chicago, and in the 1,970 seconds, that relationship became more tightly defined. Tribute moved, favors were exchanged, and disputes that crossed county lines were pushed up for resolution. It was a practical arrangement. He kept order locally and honored long-standing understandings. In return, he drew on the weight of a larger syndicate when a stubborn conflict required backing beyond his immediate reach. The connection mattered later, when federal cases sought to show a chain stretching from a corner tavern in Wisconsin to cash floors in Nevada hotels. Inside the city, not every story turned on fear. Some tavern owners felt protected under his umbrella. A problem gambler could be given a grace period. A contractor could get a nudge toward a job that kept crews busy through winter. That blend, helpful when it paid, coercive when it needed to, was the signature. People who prospered under the arrangement defended it privately as a cost of doing business in a town where quiet routes mattered more than loud slogans. For years, that approach kept him at the top without the chaos that brought down flashier bosses elsewhere. Law enforcement refused to accept those rules. Prosecutors in the early 1,970 seconds began to apply racketeering tools that allowed them to talk about patterns rather than isolated acts. The FBI refined electronics, planted microphones with better range, and learned Frank's fondness for certain seating arrangements that gave him a view of the door. Agents shifted bugs when he changed restaurants or took meetings in an office tied to a legitimate company. When he stepped outside for a walk and talk, they followed patterns rather than footsteps, studying who got called back to the table after the stroll. Those tapes mattered. They caught him discussing arrangements in careful code, but the rhythm was clear. Payments had schedules, operators had territories. Collections had methods that relied more on certainty than spectacle. When someone owed, the tone sharpened. Not a shout, a decision. If a client running card games paid late, a reminder arrived that sounded like advice, but felt like a command. If a tavern owner tried to switch machine vendors, colleagues explained the proper route. Courts would later call those explanations extortion. At the time, inside the system he built, they were presented as guidance for how to avoid problems. Beyond Milwaukee, Las Vegas gleamed on the horizon like a test of Midwestern reach. The 1,970 seconds were the era of loan-fueled casino expansion and corporate fronts that masked who benefited from unrecorded cash. The Teamsters Pension Fund financed projects that put new resorts on the Strip and in downtown Las Vegas. In that setting, Midwestern families, including Milwaukee's circle linked through Chicago and their neighbors, developed schemes to pull money straight from casino counting rooms before it reached the books. Investigators later called it skimming. Federal cases out of the Midwest and Nevada would document that pipeline, using wiretaps, ledgers, and witness testimony to show how hidden ownership and backroom influence translated into unreported cash carried in bags rather than declared to regulators. Frank's role in that world would lead to charges and a guilty plea in the mid-1,980 seconds. But the path there began earlier, through alliances built on trust, discretion, and mutual benefit. At home, he kept refining control. The vending and amusement machine business remained a pillar. Contracts were steered to friendly firms, and crews serviced routes that paid more than quarters. Wage envelopes moved in lockstep with deliveries, cash pickups, and quiet reconciliations. Tavern owners who tried independence faced a gauntlet. If polite reminders failed, they might find key nights interrupted by inspections or suppliers suddenly out of stock. Those tactics, when laid out in federal indictments, formed the backbone of extortion cases that would later put him and close family members in court. Family always occupied the center of his world. His marriage tied him to the prior generation of leadership, and his adult sons became attorneys. That duality, blood ties and legal skills, gave him confidence that he could thread needles others could not. His sons handled clients, drafted agreements, and built reputations in the courts. Their presence shielded him for a time, wrapped in the language of contracts and the routine of law offices. But when federal attention sharpened, that same proximity drew them into the storm. Prosecutors alleged that the law practice had been used not only to represent clients, but also to advance the interests of their father's organization in ways that crossed into criminal pressure. The line between legitimate counsel and coercive leverage was the battlefield on which a particularly important case would unfold. Through the mid-1970 seconds, the FBI built a portfolio of evidence. They bugged meeting spots. They collected photos of gatherings with out-of-town figures, some from Chicago, others from neighboring states. They worked informants who explained how gambling collections worked, how credit was extended to bettors at steep rates, and how a tavern's machine mix could change overnight after a pointed conversation. The narrative that emerged was not glamorous. It was businesslike, relentless, and designed to keep cash moving to the top. That was the real lesson of Frank's approach. Treat an illegal network like a company, assign responsibility, create accountability, and hide the hierarchy behind legitimate fronts. The legal dam cracked in the early 1980 seconds. Federal indictments named Frank and his sons in an extortion case tied to the coin machine and vending trade in Milwaukee. The allegations described a system in which business owners were forced through threats and interference to accept particular contracts and pay tribute that had nothing to do with normal market competition. Tapes captured coded directives. Witnesses, including tavern operators and route managers, testified about pressure and the consequences of saying no. Defense attorneys argued that the claims were misunderstandings or the exaggerations of disgruntled figures seeking leniency in their own cases. Juries, presented with recordings and corroboration, sided with prosecutors. Convictions followed. For Frank, the verdict cut deep into the image he had cultivated for decades. A judge imposed a substantial federal sentence. His sons, convicted as co-defendants in the extortion case, also received prison time. The family that had long projected a blend of propriety and clout now faced the reality of federal custody, appeals, and the public loss of reputation that comes with guilty verdicts in open court. In Milwaukee, the news landed with the weight of a concluding chapter. The man the FBI called Mr. Big was no longer the unflappable guest at the reserved table. He was an inmate with a number. Even as that case moved through sentencing, another front opened from the west. Federal prosecutors in Nevada, working with Midwestern counterparts, brought charges that tied Frank to the casino skim money diverted before it could be declared to regulators or taxed. The cases grew out of long-term investigations that tracked secret influence over hotel casino operations, loans, and hidden partners. In the mid-1980 seconds, he chose to plead guilty in the Las Vegas matter, acknowledging participation in conduct that federal agents had spent years untangling. That plea brought additional time, though the complexities of concurrent and consecutive terms meant he was facing a long stretch in federal facilities regardless of the exact math. He would spend much of that decade behind bars. Prison did not erase his old habits. He remained disciplined and orderly, kept his routines, and stayed in touch through letters and approved visits with family members who managed what remained of his network's legitimate fronts. Leadership on the street shifted. A trusted relative stepped in to manage day-to-day interests, keeping the machine business aligned and the gambling tributaries that survived under new pressure as tidy as possible. Some rivals tested boundaries, hoping to nibble at territory long considered closed. Others preferred peace, figuring that shaking the tree when federal eyes were this sharp would lead only to more subpoenas. The ripple effects went beyond Milwaukee. The extortion case against Frank and his sons signaled to Midwestern operators that the old protections were weakening. Lawyers who once glided in and out of meetings now had to consider conflicts and exposure. Business owners who had whispered for years about pressure found space, cautiously, to negotiate different terms or step outside the old arrangements entirely. None of that change happened in a week. It happened slowly, as people weighed risk, calculated loyalties, and watched who returned calls. But the arc was clear. The organization he built could still encourage compliance, yet it could not restore the old certainty. What made those cases stick was the cumulative nature of the proof. The FBI tapes did not paint a single explosive moment. They painted consistency, the same carefully chosen phrases, The same insistence on tribute dressed up as advice. The same network of collectors, couriers, and intermediaries. Documents backed the audio contracts with slanted terms. Ledger entries that matched pickup schedules. Phone logs correlated with key meetings. When jurors heard the recordings and then saw how businesses moved in step with those words, the pattern snapped into focus. It is also true that he stayed remarkably contained, even as the net closed. He avoided the public anger that some defendants displayed when cameras appeared on courthouse steps. He told friends and relatives to keep their heads down and say little. He paid for seasoned attorneys during trial and for appeals. He did not write a self-excusing memoir or try to pivot into celebrity. That quiet stubbornness had always been part of his method. It remained so under indictment and sentence alike. In the background, the Las Vegas cases redrew maps of influence. Hidden ownership was forced into the light. Casino boards toughened oversight. Teamsters' loans no longer flowed the old way. Prosecutors in Missouri, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Nevada compared notes. And figures from several cities learned that whispered arrangements in a diner could end up read aloud to a jury thousands of miles away. Frank's plea placed his name directly in that story. It labeled him, in the record, as a participant in the diversion of casino revenue, not just a rumor on the edge of gaming lore. By the time he settled into the routine of federal custody, Milwaukee had adjusted to living without his daily presence. Some businesses breathed easier. Others worried that the vacuum would produce the kind of loud contests he had always worked to prevent. The truth landed somewhere in between. There were tests and scuffles, but nothing on the scale of a war. The city remained itself, pragmatic, industrious, suspicious of spectacle. In that environment, the network he left behind retrenched where it could, surrendered what it had to, and watched for the next move from a federal establishment that had found a formula for penetrating a system built on discretion. Frank's story in this period is not a mystery novel with a twist. It is the tale of a man who believed he could run an illegal enterprise like a legitimate firm indefinitely, using politeness and force in unequal measures, while wrapping the whole thing in clean suits and quiet rooms. The 1,970 seconds and early 1,980 seconds proved that belief wrong. Electronic surveillance, racketeering statutes, and a coordinated national focus on casino corruption combined to bring him down, along with close family members who had aligned their professional paths with his. The careful smile could not shelter him from the clinical weight of recorded words. He never abandoned the habits that shaped his rise. Even in letters from prison, he urged patience, discipline, and attention to detail. Friends who visited recalled conversations about routine rather than revenge. He accepted that the old order had shifted. Yet he seemed to believe that order of some kind would always be possible if people kept their roles clear and their profiles low. That was how he had survived for so long. It was how he intended to endure now, even within walls. The city moved on. New restaurants opened. Old taverns changed hands. Machines still glowed in dim corners, though the contracts that governed them now passed through more transparent channels. The organization that had once towered over the roots still existed in fragments, carrying memory and method forward into a different era. In those fragments, you could still hear echoes of the man who had ruled that world almost without raising his voice. The man whose recorded conversations would become exhibits for a jury, and whose name spoken softly, even now remained shorthand in Milwaukee for control exercised in tailored silence. Courtrooms replaced back rooms. The rhythm of his days shifted from quiet lunches to schedules set by marshals and docket calls. The federal case that singled out his grip over coin-operated machines and tavern routes unfolded in measured steps. Tapes queued up, transcripts handed to jurors, witnesses led through direct questions. What the government offered was not a single dramatic scene but a structure. Tavern owners, route managers, and former associates described how contracts were steered, how resistance drew pressure, and how that pressure turned into payments. The law, they used the Hobbs Act, treated extortion through fear of economic harm as a federal crime when commerce crossed state lines. It fit the world he had built. He had long argued that he was simply a businessman in a competitive field. Prosecutors replied that competition does not look like contracts signed after thinly veiled threats and deliveries that stop until arrangements are honored. The recordings mattered because they captured tone as well as words. He did not bark. He set conditions. A tavern that wanted a different vendor learned, on tape, that it would be wiser to keep the route that takes care of you. A bookmaker heard that a late payment was not the way we do things. Agents who had spent years mapping his network identified voices, explained code, and matched phone calls to meetings. In the end, jurors heard more than jargon. They heard a manager directing tribute, disguised as service. When verdicts arrived, they landed like the closing click of a safe. He was convicted on federal extortion charges. His sons, both attorneys who had been part of the operation's legal shell, were convicted alongside him. The men who had projected a blend of polish and authority now faced sentences measured in years. Appeals followed, as everyone expected. Appellate judges reviewed the tapes, instructions, and the long trail of documents. The defense argued that the government had mistaken hard bargaining for criminal coercion, that witnesses had motives to shade the truth, and that coded phrases were ambiguous. The court was not persuaded. It upheld the central finding, a scheme that used fear of economic harm to force contracts and payments, reinforced by the credible threat that businesses that stepped out of line would suffer. The opinion did something else too. By laying out the pattern in organized paragraphs, it made the network legible to anyone willing to read. The invisible lines that had bound taverns, routes, collectors, and offices were now drawn in ink. Even as the Milwaukee case moved through sentencing, another matter reached him from the desert. Las Vegas had changed from a frontier town to a corporate gambling capital, but its past had left a trail of paper and audio. Midwestern outfits had quietly influenced casino operations through financing, hidden partnerships, and skimmed the unrecorded diversion of cash from counting rooms. Federal agents in several cities worked together to show how those streams were tapped. In that series of prosecutions, he chose to plead guilty to charges tied to the illegal diversion of casino revenue. The plea placed his name squarely in a national story about how money left the gaming floor without ever touching the books. It added years to his time in custody and confirmed publicly what investigators had said for years about his reach beyond Wisconsin. Prison shifted the stage, but not his habits. He kept a schedule. He avoided idle talk. He relied on letters and approved calls to keep contact with family. He was older now, and confinement transformed the smooth momentum of his life into something smaller and harsher. On the outside, the organization he had guided adapted. A trusted relative handled the day-to-day, and men who had grown up in his system maintained the vending and amusement routes that could survive in a new environment. They knew the temper of the city, the tavern owners who still preferred familiar service, and the inspectors who looked more closely now than they once did. But the certainty was gone. Competitors sought licenses, and regulators, emboldened by the public case against him, tightened oversight. The methods that had worked for 30 years no longer guaranteed outcomes. The sons who had been pillars of his legal facade faced their own reckonings. Convictions stripped away their standing at the bar. Licenses were lost. Their names, once a source of advantage in a city where last names could open doors, became shorthand for an era that judges and agents wanted to close. They served their sentences, confronted the consequences of trying to blend law and leverage, and emerged into a market where clients thought carefully before reviving old relationships. The family's image, so carefully maintained across the decades, had been dragged through affidavits, exhibits, and headlines. Meanwhile, the wider world that had given him leverage was changing. The Teamsters Pension Fund, once a key source of loans that helped build casinos and hotels, came under stricter administration. Federal consent decrees and criminal prosecutions reshaped the union's financial reach. Casino regulators in Nevada demanded clearer ownership and stronger controls. Counting rooms that had once been porous were now watched by cameras and auditors trained to spot patterns. Chicago, long the gravitational center for Milwaukee's crew, faced its own wave of convictions as bosses linked to casino skimming went to prison. That meant the old avenues for pressure and protection narrowed. The phrase, "call our friends down south," lost some of its force when those friends were in cells or sitting with their lawyers. Milwaukee itself evolved. The state lottery arrived. Tribal casinos opened and pulled gamblers into legal spaces. Bookmakers still existed, but the casual bettor found other outlets. Tavern machines continued to light up corners, but the business shifted toward corporate vendors who could pass licensing reviews and spreadsheet audits. The space for private power, the gray zone between a handshake and a threat, shrank. When people talked about routes now, they meant delivery schedules and service calls, not a silent tax owed to an address no one dared say aloud. He would have understood the logic. He had always approached his world as a business. It's just that the business he built depended on secrecy, and secrecy is hard to maintain when technology and statutes turn shadows into evidence. Inside, he remained what he had always been, a man who prized control. Visitors described him as composed, more focused on routine than reminiscence. He did not seek notoriety or publicity. That kept him safer in a place where fame can be a liability. He followed rules, made few complaints, and waited. Waiting had been one of his core skills on the outside, waiting out a rival, waiting on a license, waiting until everyone came to him because they needed order. Now, waiting meant years in federal custody, marked by holiday phone calls and carefully worded letters. His path to freedom was bound to time served and the balance of his cases. When he did return to Milwaukee in the early 1990 seconds, he was older and quieter. The city still looked like the city he had managed: lake air, brick taverns, winter salt on curbs, but the alignments had shifted. Old allies were retired or dead. Younger men had learned caution from his case and kept their heads down. Agents still noted his movements, but the surveillance felt almost historical, as if they were tracing the outline of a figure who had already been captured by history's frame. He met with family, appeared occasionally at familiar restaurants, and kept his voice low. He did not stage a comeback. He lived as a man who knew that the era that made him possible had ended. Despite that, the habits he cultivated left traces. Some tavern owners still preferred the companies he had once backed because service was reliable and technicians showed up on time. Certain disputes still ended with a phone call rather than a lawsuit. But the city now had more referees, regulators, auditors, licensing boards. What had once been resolved in a booth was now handled with forms. The underground economy that he had coordinated did not vanish entirely in formal systems. Rarely do, but it lost its central conductor. Public perception softened with time. In the 1960 seconds and 1970 seconds, his name had traveled city blocks as rumor and warning. Now it was more likely to turn up in a retrospective piece, a university lecture about organized crime in the Midwest, or an FBI agent's talk on the usefulness of patient surveillance. That shift did not absolve him. The record is the record, but it reframed him as part of a broader story about immigrant neighborhoods, upward mobility, and the way power can harden into illegality when it refuses outside rules. He would not have cared much for the sociology. He would have asked who was collecting, who was paying, and how clean the paperwork looked. The most telling measure of his career's impact is how it reshaped the city's tolerance for silent authority. For decades, many small business owners accepted the costs of his order because the street stayed calm and the cash drawers balanced. The federal cases made that trade explicit. People saw the price. They saw the fear hidden behind polite phrases. They learned, through transcripts, how a gentle reminder could carry the weight of a threat. That knowledge does not vanish. It becomes a civic memory, a reason that newer generations approach backroom bargains with skepticism and tape recorders that fit in a palm. He did not speak publicly about regret. That was not his way. His closest circle remembers advice about keeping setbacks private, about preparing for each day the night before, about never letting impatience show. Those were the habits that kept him in command for so long. They were also the habits that made him underestimate how much recorded fragments, small pieces gathered patiently, could unmake a reputation built over decades. In that sense, his story became a study in how modern law enforcement learns to listen for the music beneath the words. As his health declined, he narrowed his world to family and familiar faces. He maintained the composure that had once intimidated rivals, now used to reassure children and old friends. Milwaukee learned of his death with a mix of curiosity and inevitability. Obituaries called him a reputed boss. Reporters summarized the extortion convictions and the Nevada plea in quick paragraphs. People who had never met him repeated the nickname agents used: Mr. Big. Those who had dealt with him in business remembered a handshake, a calm voice, an insistence that everyone know their place. The city he left behind kept moving. Taverns poured drinks, machines flickered, unions bargained. Casinos far away spun lights that no longer hid backroom diversions as easily as they once had. The FBI archived tapes that had helped prosecutors tell juries how a soft-spoken man could bend an economy. Law students read opinions that grew out of his appeals. Young entrepreneurs measured risk differently because their parents had told them stories about contracts signed under pressure and deliveries that stopped when the wrong vendor's truck appeared at the curb. There is a tendency to turn such a life into legend, to file away the hard edges and elevate strategy as if it were wisdom. The record is less forgiving. It shows money collected because people were afraid to say no, careers broken, and public trust undermined. It shows, too, that the instruments of accountability laws, surveillance, patient investigators, and jurors willing to weigh dull but damning evidence can succeed without spectacle. In that way, the end of his career reads like a civics lesson delivered in whispers. Institutions work when they learn to hear what quiet power sounds like. He never stopped expecting order. Even when order no longer answered to him, he preferred steadiness to drama. That might be why the city, even now, speaks of him in low volume. He was the figure in the corner whose presence made conversations shorter. He was the phone call that changed a delivery route. He was the man who could meet a stranger's eyes and make clear that a decision had already been reached. When the system that sustained that authority finally failed him, it did so without fireworks. It logged calls, collected invoices, rolled tape, and turned the ordinary acts of a working day into the spine of a case. That is how a man who avoided headlines for most of his life ended up in them. He fits into the Midwestern map of organized crime, as a crucial marker between Chicago's dominance and the smaller cities whose economies could be guided by a single tactician. Tribute moved south for decades. Influence flowed back north when needed. His case reminded everyone that the chain runs both ways when accountability is involved. Once the Chicago leadership fell to casino-esque prosecutions, Milwaukee's guardrail weakened. Without that outer ring, the inner circle could not defend itself against modern investigations that did not need fear to do their work, only time, tape, and patience. Years after his death, the buildings where he liked to meet still stand. Some hold new restaurants. Others host offices with bright lobbies and security cameras. People walk past without a thought for the booths where a certain kind of decision used to be reached. The city rarely memorializes men like him with plaques or portraits. His archive is different. Transcripts, exhibits, sentencing memos, and the memories of men and women who used to glance at the door mid-conversation because habit taught them that a door could change everything. The way his story sits in Milwaukee memory is layered, like a city street built over older cobblestones. On the surface, you see court dates and headlines, but underneath there are the daily routines he engineered, the quiet visits, the long years when his name passed between business owners like a password. To understand how that happened, you can't only look at the end, when jurors listened to tapes and the judge read out a sentence. You have to walk back through the customs he enforced, the networks he built in plain sight, and the way he turned a neighborhood's habits into an engine that paid him first. He came of age when cash businesses ruled corner blocks. Taverns anchored social life. Supper clubs hired musicians. Factories ran 3 shifts. And pay envelopes pushed people into bars after work. Machines lived in those rooms. Jukeboxes, pinball, cigarette vendors, later video games. Each one needed a supplier, a repair crew, a collector who emptied the coin box and logged the intake. That chain sounds simple until you add real people and their needs. A tavern owner wants regular service and no trouble. A distributor wants guaranteed placement. A collector wants safety and predictability. Frank recognized that if he could control each link, the whole chain would hum. He didn't need to own every company. He needed contracts to point in a direction that served him. That insight didn't make him unique. It made him effective. Others saw the same opportunity, especially in the 1,950 seconds when the city's economy grew and nights out lasted longer. The difference was his discipline. He favored companies with neat books, men who shaved every morning, drivers who didn't talk much. He discouraged temper. He pushed for steady schedules. He instructed lieutenants to listen to complaints and solve them fast so tavern owners felt looked after. That effort created a sense of order, and order created leverage. When an owner tried to switch vendors, the message returned soft. At first, remember who keeps you stocked. Remember who takes care of problems after midnight. If the hint didn't land, there were escalations. Deliveries might slip. A permit issue might surface. A Friday night inspection could arrive at the worst time. None of those steps looked violent on paper, But together they convinced people to sign contracts and keep them. Law enforcement saw the pattern and called it by its name. When a business signs because it fears what happens if it doesn't, that's extortion. When that business buys supplies from out of state, that conduct reaches federal law. Agents didn't have to guess. Over the years, they recorded him and his associates using careful phrases that meant exactly what witnesses later explained. Stay in line. Keep your route. Don't move machines without a conversation. The defense tried to pull those phrases into the realm of tough bargaining. Jurors didn't agree because the pattern matched what they heard. It would be easy to tell the story as a straight line from ambition to indictment, but that ignores how many people lived under his version of stability for how long. You could call the number posted on a machine and a technician would show up. If you ran a bar in a rough pocket, you felt safer aligned with his circle because trouble tended to glance off rooms that paid their dues. He paired favors with demands. He gave loans at rates that bound people to him. He made introductions that landed a cousin a job on a hotel project. To families who benefited, he looked like a reliable problem solver. To businesses that wanted freedom, he looked like a gatekeeper you couldn't dodge. The rumor that trailed him through the 1,960 seconds was always the same. Disputes over routes sometimes turned explosive. Investigators tied a series of bombings and attempted bombings in Milwaukee to fights over the machine trade. The blasts rattled windows and sent clear warnings, even when no one was hurt. Frank was widely suspected as the man who benefited most from a climate in which rivals thought twice. He denied involvement, and the state never secured a conviction against him tied to those attacks. But the fact that such acts happened at all targeting bars, cars, storefronts, added a darker edge to the order that kept his system running. People knew what defiance could cost, even if the connection never showed up in a courtroom. His standing rose in part because of marriage. Ties to the Aliotto family put him close to the seat of power in the city's Italian community. Older men saw him as capable, discreet, a man who would not waste energy on shows of force when a nod would do. As the 1,950 seconds turned and new leaders stepped back, he stepped up without fanfare. Chicago mattered here too. Milwaukee's underworld had always lived in the shadow of the bigger city to the south. Tribute moved down, guidance moved up. He honored that arrangement and earned room to run his town. When an argument crossed Milwaukee's boundaries, he leaned on relationships in Illinois and elsewhere. That gave him confidence. It also tied his fate to a regional hierarchy that would later fall under the weight of casino scandals. The move into the Las Vegas stream did not happen overnight. In the late 1,960 seconds and early 1,970 seconds, gambling in Nevada grew in scale and sophistication. New hotels rose with financing that blended bank loans and union pension money. In that world, Midwestern outfits found a way to plant influence in counting rooms and management suites through friendly fronts. Skimming, pulling unrecorded cash before it hit the ledger, became a steady source of side income for bosses far from the desert. Frank's name appears in that chapter through federal cases that ultimately persuaded him to plead guilty. He was not the only one. Chicago, Kansas City, Cleveland, and others saw their people indicted as well. The investigations used wiretaps, ledgers, and testimony to map how money left a casino floor, traveled in bags, and landed in hands not listed in any corporate filing. It took years to assemble that proof. When prosecutors were ready, the web snapped shut. At home, he never stopped treating illegal work like a business. Sports betting required credit, collectors, and a way to resolve disputes without calling police. Numbers betting moved quieter but added up across a city that liked small wagers. Loans at steep rates tied into both. When bettors fell behind, they borrowed. When borrowers missed payments, pressure followed. It began as a reminder, grew into an expectation, and could turn into real fear. Again, he didn't need to throw a punch. He needed people to understand that an unpaid debt had consequences. Agents captured the tone on tape. Judges explained the law in instructions to jurors. The words reached a verdict. Those jurors saw his son seated beside him. Both were lawyers. They handled clients, drew up agreements, and stood in courtrooms where their last name counted for something in a city where lineage still opened doors. In the eyes of federal prosecutors, their law practice became part of the machine that pushed contracts and collected money. The extortion case that convicted all three cut through that legal camouflage. Appeals did not change the outcome. The licenses that gave the son standing in the bar were stripped away. The family image, religious, well-dressed, generous at charity dinners, split under the hard light of transcripts and tapes. If you look at his approach over decades, you see a set of rules he expected of those around him. Don't speak out of turn. Don't call attention to yourself. Dress like you belong in any room. Keep accounts straight. He tolerated no freelancing. That steadiness attracted men who liked clear lines, who wanted to know exactly how to avoid trouble. It also made him underestimate how drastically the ground had shifted under his shoes by the 1,970 seconds. After Congress passed racketeering laws and courts approved wider use of wiretaps, the old ways of hiding power in the shadows stopped working as well. Agents didn't need confessions. They needed patience and audio quality. He had the patience too. He had built a career on waiting, but you cannot wait out a tape. The trials in the early 1,980 seconds stripped away the protective layers around him. They showed how the polite phrase in a booth connected to a delivery schedule, a Friday night interruption, a spike in inspections. They showed how a meeting with out-with-of-town figures preceded a change in how a bookmaker ran his book. They showed, in the Las Vegas case, how a phone call in Milwaukee matched a cash shortfall, noticed by an auditor who had learned, finally, to look for it. You do not need a violent scene to prove domination. You need repetition, corroboration, and the willingness to explain to jurors that power often sounds like a suggestion. Prison seemed to confirm that his system could function without him if discipline held. A relative took over daily duty. The men who had organized routes and gambling pools followed the old playbook, minus the old certainty. Regulators carried clipboards into places once ruled by winks. Competitors tried their luck with licenses and bids. Some tavern owners, newly emboldened, compared offers without calling anyone first. There were still consequences if you crossed the wrong person, but the temperature dropped. The city did not erupt. It adjusted. One contract at a time. He returned older, his health worn down by years in federal custody. He slipped into a quiet routine, meals with family, short visits with friends, and the occasional lunch in a room where the staff knew him. Agents still noted his presence, more out of habit than fear. People watched to see if he would try to reassert authority. He did not. The world that had once flicked to attention when he entered a room had moved on. Gambling had outlets in legal casinos. The state lottery pulled small bets into official channels. Vending and amusement contracts went to companies that could survive licensing reviews, audits, and competition without the shadow of a threat. His last years passed without drama. He remained composed. He offered the same old advice to the young. Keep steady. Think ahead. Do not invite attention. When he died, the city balanced curiosity with fatigue. Reporters recited the facts. Alleged boss of the Milwaukee family, convicted of extortion, pleaded guilty in a Las Vegas skimming case, served years in prison. Friends remembered dinners and favors, a calm tone, a belief that every problem had a correct handling. Critics remembered fear, forced signatures, and money taken because people believed bad things would happen if they refused. Both portraits were true, and both had been true for a long time. The ripple of his career continued after he was gone. The tapes that brought him down became teaching tools for new investigators who wanted to know how to hear code without guessing. Prosecutors used his case when explaining to a jury why Hobbs Act extortion covers more than a man with a gun demanding a wallet. Law students read appellate opinions that grew out of his appeals. Business owners told their children that what looks like a favor can be a leash. People still whispered his name sometimes, not as a threat, but as a reminder that polite authority can be a mask for coercion. There is a temptation to look for glamour in such a life, to lean into cigars and corner booths and the illusion of class. The documents flatten that out. They list amounts collected, dates, names, routes, and the language people use to avoid saying what they meant. They show what illegal power looks like when you strip away myth, a finely tuned pressure system that keeps money flowing up and alternatives shut down. He was very good at building and maintaining that system. That is why it lasted. That is why the cases against him took so long to assemble. It is also why the fall, when it came, felt thorough. Recorded fragments turned into a map, and once the map existed, the route to conviction became direct. You can still find people in Milwaukee who would argue that the streets were calmer under his watch, that he kept disputes from turning into chaos. There is a kernel of truth in that sentiment. He valued order. He invested in predictable routines, but order gained by fear is not free. It drains a city in slow ways, taking choices off the table, turning independent owners into quiet tenants of someone else's plan. The courts made that point more effectively than any editorial ever could when they played his words back to him and asked a jury whether a contract signed in that context reflected consent. In the end, his story reads like the arc of a particular American moment. Immigrant families built enclaves, created prosperity, and some men converted their talent for organization into influence that crossed from legitimate to criminal. For a while, they operated in zones where silence protected them. Then technology, law, and national coordination tightened the net. The men who believed that politeness could shield coercion learned that microphones don't care about manners. Frank learned that lesson late, in a courtroom where even his measured voice could no longer disguise what it was doing. He would have recognized the irony. He had always solved problems by making people accept a version of reality that served him. In the end, he faced a system that did the same to him. The transcript spoke. The rules applied. The sentences stood. The city absorbed it and moved forward, carrying both the memory of how he ruled and the knowledge of how he was finally undone. He built his advantage by mastering the unnoticed details of how a city works. In Milwaukee, neighborhood life revolved around places that handled cash, where receipts piled up in drawers and business depended on predictable evenings. The men who serviced jukeboxes and pinball machines carried calendars in their heads. Which tavern filled up after a factory's second shift? Which corner bar drew crowds after Friday paychecks? Which owners called when a needle stuck and the music cut out? Frank took that map and turned it into leverage. He didn't need a stage. He needed routes, schedules, and the quiet expectation that contracts would point toward firms aligned with him. For years, that is how the machine trade in the city functioned, with placement and service tied to a network that rewarded compliance and made defiance uncomfortable. Investigators later described it as extortion held together by a velvet rope, the kind of pressure that keeps a smile on the surface and fear underneath. His approach to gambling followed the same logic. Numbers bets traveled through barbacks and bartenders who knew their clientele and their limits. Sports wagers pulsed heavier on weekends and playoff nights. Credit greased the system, offering regulars room to bet beyond cash on hand, and that credit carried a price that kept people on the hook. Collections were methodical. A missed payment drew a reminder phrased as advice. A second miss narrowed options. By the time a third deadline approached, the borrower understood that continuing to ignore calls would create problems far beyond a single debt. Court filings and testimony put him at the top of that structure, a man who preferred order to spectacle and insisted that the men who worked under him avoid impulsive acts that might draw patrol cars or headlines. Discretion fed stability. He organized meetings in places with predictable noise restaurants, with clinking glassware, back tables at lunch, car parks with constant traffic, then kept his voice low and his sentences short. Associates learned to talk in code, to avoid proper nouns, to refer to routes, friends, or arrangements. That habit slowed investigators at first, but it could not stop what followed when federal law evolved. Title III wiretaps allowed the FBI to record conversations under court order, and agents refined minimization and placement techniques until microphones sat where he liked to talk. Tapes captured the cadence of his control. The nod before a decision. The phrase that signaled a directive. The careful framing of a warning as good counsel. Those recordings would become the backbone of the extortion case that defined the 1,980 seconds in Milwaukee's underworld. The government's narrative of his machine route dominance was not just about who got to place a jukebox in a busy bar. It was about what happened to someone who tried to choose differently. Tavern owners testified that deliveries got delayed, service calls went unanswered, or inspectors arrived with unusual zeal after they entertained bids from competitors. Vendors who tried to carve out turf without clearing it with his circle found contracts drying up, and customers visited by men who explained the city's practical realities. The Hobbs Act allowed prosecutors to argue that fear of economic harm of losing deliveries, of being singled out for burdens, counts as extortion when mixed with the commerce that crosses state lines in the form of machines, parts, and cash banks. Juries listened to that argument while hearing the tapes, and they agreed The system he ran was a shakedown in business attire. His ascent had always been tied to relationships that stretched beyond Milwaukee. The Chicago outfit's gravity shaped the region. For decades, smaller cities acknowledged that power, sending tribute and receiving backing when disputes escalated. Frank earned his space by honoring those arrangements while running his town without noise. That same tie pulled him into a larger story when Las Vegas exploded with new money and white-collar front companies. Teamsters pension funds helped finance casino purchases. Corporate shells blurred ownership. In that labyrinth, Midwestern bosses influenced operations, and skimming flourished cash, lifted in counting rooms before it ever touched the ledger. National investigations pieced together how Cleveland, Kansas City, Chicago, and Milwaukee figures cooperated in that enterprise. Court documents from those cases named him among the men who benefited, and in the mid-1980s he pleaded guilty to participating in the illegal diversion of casino revenue, adding years to the time he was already serving in the extortion case. He expected loyalty from family, and for years his sons provided it as attorneys who reinforced the image of legitimacy. They drafted contracts, represented clients, and met with business owners whose livelihoods depended on the routes. When indictments landed in the early 1980s, prosecutors said the law office had been used to advance the same pressure that collectors applied in the field, only with letterhead and professional phrasing. The evidence convinced jurors, and all three men, father and sons, were convicted. The court stripped the sons of their law licenses. Appeals argued over what those coded words meant and whether witnesses had reasons to curry favor, but the convictions stood. The result echoed around the city's legal and business scenes. If the most polished version of the network could be proven extortionate, then the days of mistaking poise for innocence were over. It's worth understanding why so many accepted the arrangement for so long. Some bar owners genuinely felt safer with his people around. A phone call solved problems that otherwise might have lingered until closing time. A machine repair arrived quickly. A short-term loan kept inventory stocked. Gratitude blended with dependence, and dependence became leverage. That is how patronage systems work. Favors create bonds that feel like friendship until the bill comes due. In public, Frank maintained the look of a benefactor church attendance, donations to community events, seats at charity banquets. In private, he insisted on tribute. The public image bought him time. The private demands built his case file. Investigators built their proof one routine at a time. They matched his meetings to calls, then to deliveries, then to statements by tavern owners and route managers. They showed how a phrase on tape aligned with a shift in service. They set out timetables for pickups and connected those to ledger entries in companies aligned with his circle. When a reluctant witness hesitated, they played audio. When a defense lawyer argued that a sentence sounded ambiguous, they produced three more that echoed the first. The case was not cinematic, it was meticulous. That method mirrors how he ran his system. He valued repetition, reliability, predictability. Those qualities, when captured by a microphone, turned into a prosecutor's best ally. Reports from the 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds also described a series of bombings and attempted bombings related to struggles over the machine business in Milwaukee. Cars, storefronts, and the exteriors of bars were damaged. Those blasts created fear without lengthy court battles, sending a message that competition carried risks. Law enforcement and journalists often suspected organized crime figures were behind the violence, and his name surfaced in speculation because he stood to gain from rivals' fear. He denied involvement, and he was not convicted in connection with those explosions. That distinction matters. So does the climate that those acts produced. Even when the origin of a blast remained officially unsolved, the effect on behavior was stark. Fewer challenges, more quiet deals, a stronger hold over routes. The relationship with Las Vegas deserves a closer look because it reveals how a Midwestern boss could influence events in a desert city without appearing on a corporate chart. The Argent Corporation era brought the Stardust and Fremont into the spotlight as casinos where hidden partners exercised control. Midwestern bosses funneled advice and demands through trusted intermediaries, ensured that casino managers friendly to their interests stayed in place, and pulled unrecorded cash before it entered the count. The Kansas City wiretaps that anchored Operation Strawman captured damning conversations among figures who discussed discipline, shares, and the logistics of moving money. Milwaukee's involvement showed up as part of that regional chain. Frank's guilty plea in the Nevada matter acknowledged that connection without putting on a public trial that would have forced witnesses to relive the scheme in detail. The plea spoke for itself. He accepted the government's charge that he had a hand in diverting casino proceeds. While he served time, the old network did not simply vanish. A relative managed surviving interests. Men trained in his way of doing business tried to keep the machine routes profitable and the remaining gambling operations discreet, but the context had changed. Auditors and regulators tested contracts for signs of coercion. State agencies paid closer attention to licensing. The press, emboldened by the convictions, reported with more specificity about how route monopolies had worked. Bar owners compared notes. Competing vendors, now confident they could call a lawyer instead of an arranger, bid openly for placements that had once been untouchable. The machine business did not cease. It professionalized. A broader gambling ecosystem also shifted. The launch of a state lottery and the spread of tribal casinos provided legal outlets that siphoned off wagers that once fed street bookmakers. Nevada modernized oversight with cameras, improved accounting, and boards wary of shadows in ownership. The Teamsters Pension Fund, central to earlier casino financing, came under strict supervision as part of a push to separate union coffers from criminal influence. Those changes squeezed the space where his kind of quiet authority had lived. In a cleaner market with more regulators and legitimate opportunities, the advantages of coercion diminished. You could still threaten someone, but the risk-reward balance had flipped. His later years outside custody were subdued. He returned to a city that still looked familiar, but felt different in its nerve endings. People recognized him, and some still deferred out of habit or respect for past favors, but the reflex to call him before making a move had faded. Agents continued to note sightings and meetings. The routine details: who he lunched with, whether a known associate dropped by, went into files more for completeness than for imminent prosecution. He did not attempt to rebuild a toppled pyramid. Age, health, and the transformed landscape made a comeback unrealistic. He chose quiet, family, and limited social circles. Death closed the file in a literal sense, but not in memory. He died in 1993, and obituaries emphasized the key facts. Longtime Milwaukee figure linked by federal authorities to illegal gambling and extortion, convicted on multiple counts in a high-profile case in the 1,980 seconds, later pleading guilty in a Las Vegas skimming prosecution, served years in federal prison. Former associates remembered calm conversation and an insistence on neat edges. Business owners who had lived under his system recalled the pressure that sat behind each friendly reminder. Reporters who had covered the trials tried to balance the local color with the weight of what the convictions represented. A civic shift from whispered compliance to public accountability. The legal footprint he left behind still teaches lessons. His case shows how a soft-spoken person can run a coercive system that leaves few bruises but many victims. It demonstrates the reach of the Hobbs Act when commerce is shaped by fear. It illustrates how wiretaps, when used under careful judicial oversight, can reveal the meaning of coded talk without sensationalism. And it underscores how regional cooperation among prosecutors Midwest U.S. attorneys sharing intelligence with Nevada counterparts can tell juries the full story of schemes that cross state lines and industries. People sometimes ask whether the city was safer when one figure enforced a rough order. The honest answer depends on what you value. He did calm certain conflicts by imposing a hierarchy that fewer dared challenge. But that calm came at a cost. Higher prices baked into contracts, limited choice for small businesses, and a culture of secrecy that punished independence. The alternative rule of law moves slower and feels less decisive, yet it opens space for competition and personal agency. Milwaukee's evolution after his fall illustrated that trade. The city managed risk with oversight, not fear. It replaced the hint with the form, the unspoken rule with written policy. There is no need to mythologize him to appreciate his place in history. He was a capable organizer who treated illegal earnings like a firm's revenue. He built loyalty by pairing favors with expectation. He preferred calculation to bravado. Those traits sustained him for decades and made him formidable. They also blinded him to the ways technology and statutes would erode his shield. When microphones made it possible to hear how he used polite words to impose control, the core of his advantage, seeming civility, became evidence against him. If you walk through Milwaukee now, you can still find the buildings where he met people, though most have new menus and different music drifting from the speakers. In some basements, there are old outlets where a jukebox once plugged in, remnants of a trade that spun coin into influence. Talk to older owners, and they will tell you about service calls that always arrived on time, about payment schedules that never slipped, about the relief and the tension of living inside a system that kept the neighborhood orderly while closing doors they wanted to open. That dual memory is the most accurate portrait. He gave them predictability. He charged them a hidden tax for it. The ending of his story does not erase what came before, and the beginning does not excuse what came after. They are of a piece. Young Frank learned how to read a room, how to make silence speak. Older Frank discovered that recordings can give silence a caption. Between those points lies a career that touched taverns, courts, counting rooms, union loans, and a city's sense of who decides which songs play on a Friday night. His life remains instructive precisely because it resists easy labels. He was neither a cartoon villain nor a misunderstood civic planner. He was a man who turned social networks into private power, who broke laws systematically, and who faced the consequences when institutions caught up to his methods. He learned early that control rests in the middles, not the edges. Middlemen deliver envelopes, grease schedules, whisper reminders, and translate instructions into routine. That is where he lived, between owners and vendors, between bookmakers and bettors, between the glow of a jukebox and the signature on a contract. Milwaukee's streets gave him the stage. Brick taverns with steamed windows in winter. Corner restaurants where lunch stretched past 2. Hotel lobbies where a nod could summon a man from a chair without a word. He did not have to raise his voice. He only had to decide whose timetable mattered. The machine world fit him because it rewarded patience and punished noise. A route is a promise. Technicians will show up, collections will be fair, new releases will arrive on time. A bartender can expect the title everyone asks for. If a rival offered the same package without clearing it with his circle, the rival learned that promises are fragile. Maybe the delivery truck hit traffic every week. Maybe a repairman stopped answering calls. Maybe a friendly inspector, acting within his discretion, decided to look more closely at a license renewal. None of those moments broke laws on their face. Taken together, they changed decisions. That pattern is what the FBI taught jurors to see when they rolled tapes and matched them to calendars and ledgers. He surrounded himself with men who liked clarity. They carried notebooks instead of boasting. They parked straight and wore clean shoes. They knew how to keep a meeting from turning into an argument. One handled coin counts and service calls. Another tracked which bars were growing, which were sliding, which owners were unhappy. A third took care of credit for gamblers after payday, extending lines that looked like favors and felt like borrowings until fees stacked up. Each man had a role, and the roles overlapped just enough that gaps were rare. When a tavern switched vendors, the collector knew before the new machine warmed up. When a bettor tried to disappear, someone recognized his car parked 3 blocks from a place he still liked to visit. Information held the web together. He cultivated professionals too, accountants who balanced books so legitimate fronts survived audits. Bankers who valued steady deposits and didn't ask extra questions about cash-heavy clients with solid references. Lawyers, most notably his sons, who could turn a tense meeting into a formal letter that sounded lawful even when the point underneath was pressure. That blend of street routine and office polish made the network feel like a business, not a racket, to those inside it. You could see why people stayed. Things got done. Problems, for a time, stayed small. But the same traits that enabled his run created the record that ended it. Agents do not need explosions when patterns are this tight. They need echoes, phrases that repeat, behaviors that follow. They sat outside restaurants in cold cars with thermoses and cameras. They learned where he liked to sit, which wall he faced, which exit he watched. They placed microphones under judicial order in spots where plates clinked and conversations overlapped, then combed the noise for codes that turned into directives when matched to what happened next. When a tavern owner balked and 2 days later, a service team skipped him for a week, the timing mattered. When a bookmaker came up short and Within hours, 2 calls went out to men who knew how to collect politely and firmly. The recorded phrases made the connections visible. His insistence on decorum might seem like a small detail, but it was a tool. He wanted his people to look like they belonged anywhere. Shirts pressed, hair trimmed, paperwork carried in simple folders, never loose. That image disarmed some, soothed others, and gave cover to meetings that would have looked suspicious if they were conducted in alleys. He believed deeply that how you present yourself shapes outcomes. For a long time, he was right. Then presentation became evidence. Jurors who heard the measured tones and saw the neat ledgers understood that coercion doesn't need shouting. It can arrive dressed for dinner. The city's immigrant fabric gave him shelter and reach. Festivals, parish events, and neighborhood fundraisers brought people together who might otherwise have stayed strangers. He showed up and listened. He paid for table sponsorships and sent envelopes to causes that told a story of civic spirit. Those gestures produced goodwill that made introductions simpler when he needed to place a machine or secure a supply contract for a friend. To many in those circles, he was just a man who supported community institutions and knew everyone. That public face bought time whenever rumors flared. You could believe 2 things at once: that he was generous at a fundraiser, and that the same week a bar owner signed a contract because saying no felt unsafe. His influence over gambling followed an old Midwestern rhythm. Bets tied to baseball and football built slowly through weekdays, spiked on weekends, and settled on Mondays. Numbers play ran quietly through bartenders' back pockets and corner stores that looked like they sold only coffee and cigarettes. Credit turned repeat bettors into steady customers. Collections turned reluctance into compliance. The law calls it loan sharking when interest rates and enforcement methods cross the line. Investigators wrote that word into reports about his circle, laying out how borrowers found themselves with fewer choices every week. He did not need to be present for those conversations. His name hovered above them as motive enough. Connections to Chicago remained a constant. For decades, Milwaukee's operation sent respect south and received space to manage its own city. Men from the outfit came up for meals and meetings. He went down for sit-downs when disputes reached beyond county borders. That relationship steadied his hand locally and tied him to wider schemes. When Las Vegas became the common project, the place where counting rooms held more cash than most Midwestern streets saw in a month, those ties paid. Skimming never needed his face on a casino license. It needed understanding between men who could keep books flexible and managers cooperative. The federal cases that blew open the Argent era traced lines from Nevada through Kansas City and Chicago to Milwaukee. He accepted the Nevada charges rather than fight them at trial, a calculation that suggested he knew the tapes and witnesses were enough to make the government's case. The plea added years and drew his name permanently into a story larger than his city. The extortion case at home hinged on translating etiquette into coercion. That was the government's challenge and its triumph. A polite request becomes a threat when everyone at the table knows what defiance costs. The Seventh Circuit opinion that upheld his conviction spent pages explaining that fear of economic harm, the loss of deliveries, the sudden lack of service, the business disruptions that follow refusing the arrangement fits the statute when interstate commerce is involved. The court's language turned his method into precedent, a guide for future prosecutions. Law students still read those paragraphs to understand how modern extortion looks and sounds. Reports from earlier decades, of course, included darker episodes that investigators linked to fights over machine territory. Explosions outside bars, damage to vehicles, blasts that arrived before dawn as warnings. His name surfaced because his circle had the most to gain from fear. He denied involvement, and neither state nor federal prosecutors convicted him for those acts. The caution stands. Suspicion is not proof. Yet the climate those incidents created mattered. In a city where a handful of attacks could echo for years, people did not need a second warning to avoid crossing certain lines. That atmosphere helped him consolidate routes without the constant firefighting that undisciplined rivals invited. He understood politics as well as he did business, not in terms of campaigns, but in the quieter mechanics of permits and licenses. Tavern owners lived and died by paperwork, occupancy limits, entertainment permissions, hours. If you controlled the routes and you had friends who respected your calls, You could shape how strictly rules were applied while insisting you had done nothing more than ask a question. That kind of soft leverage is hard to prosecute until microphones capture the nudge and the follow-through. The tapes did, laying bare the utility of a well-timed inquiry as pressure masquerading as concern. His son's presence at his side in court marked a painful symmetry. He had raised them to master the formal world he treated as a shield: courtrooms, motions, clean signatures. By bringing them into his business orbit, he fused that world to his private one. When indictments named them, when juries convicted them, the cost was more than years. Licenses vanished, careers ended. Family dinners once filled with strategy turned into discussions of appeals, sentencing ranges, and the logistics of visits. Milwaukee watched the transformation with fascination and a bit of grief. Even those who disliked him understood that the collapse of a family's public standing carries its own sorrow. Inside prison, he adapted by shrinking his domain to what he could control. Wake early, read, write letters, keep appointments, avoid complaining. He corresponded with relatives who were trying to hold together what remained of legitimate businesses, passing along the old advice: be steady, stay quiet, keep the books clean, even as the market around them changed. Competitors without his aura found they could win contracts by offering better terms and reliable service backed by warranties instead of whispers. Regulators liked that shift. So did a generation of owners who had quietly despised the hidden tax his system had imposed. When he returned, Milwaukee greeted him with a kind of wary courtesy. He was no longer a mystery. His voice had been played for juries. His methods had been described in affidavits and opinions. He walked into restaurants where the staff still remembered his preferences and took a corner table without the room holding its breath. Some associates stopped by to pay respects, almost like visiting a retired executive from a company that no longer existed. He did not try to reclaim the old command, because the old command depended on a web that had been cut. Age and realities did the rest. He died not long after, in 1993, his last years spent at home, out of headlines. The obituaries tilted toward the record: reputed Milwaukee boss, convicted in an extortion case built on FBI recordings, later pleaded guilty in a Las Vegas skim prosecution, served significant time in federal custody. People who had brushed against his world offered two sorts of memories: kindnesses and pressures. A favor that made a bill disappear, a warning that made a decision easy. Both were true. That is how he operated. What followed his death clarifies his legacy. The machine business in Milwaukee matured into a version of itself that could withstand auditors and compete in bids without whispered caveats. Gambling shifted toward legal channels where losses and wins appeared on screens without bookies' ledgers in the back room. Federal strike forces, having used his case as a study guide, applied the same patient methods elsewhere. Community institutions that had once depended on envelopes from men like him diversified donors and learned to keep their books as carefully as any regulator could ask. The city retained its pragmatism but set firmer boundaries around who gets to define order. Even so, his name still surfaces when older owners tell younger ones how things used to work. They describe the relief of a service truck that always arrived on time, and the dread that came with the idea of canceling a contract. They recall the feeling of safety that came with his umbrella and the cost of living under it. Those stories matter because they resist glamour. They make plain that stability enforced by private power carries a price that is paid by people too small to fight back until institutions take their side. He did not think of himself as a villain. He thought of himself as a manager of reality, a man who translated human frailty temptation to bet, desire for convenience, fear of chaos into a system that made money. He believed, with some justification for many years, that he could keep that system from tipping into spectacle. Modern law enforcement forced a different translation. It listened, mapped, and showed the rest of the city how control can sound like kindness. Once that picture existed, juries did not need him to shout. They only needed him to be himself on tape. The lesson that runs beneath his story is not complicated. Power hides best in routines. If you want to find it, track routines. He built a career on that insight. The FBI ended it using the same principle. He taught his people to anticipate needs and remove friction. Agents anticipated meetings and removed ambiguity. In both cases, patience outran bravado. That is why he lasted so long and why, in the end, he fell so completely. Walk past the old haunts today, and you will not feel menace. You will see servers balancing plates, couples splitting a pizza, an owner wiping the bar after last call. The machines have newer lights. The contracts sit in cloud folders instead of desk drawers. But the city hasn't forgotten who once decided which songs played and who got to switch vendors without a phone call. That memory keeps boundaries clear. It reminds people that a polite tone can be a tool, that a favor can be a leash, and that uniformed patience inside a courtroom or behind a surveillance van's steamed windows can restore choices that once belonged to one man's map. He measured strength by how much could be done without raising a hand or a voice. If a tavern changed machines after a sales pitch, he did not send a scene to the doorway. He sent time. The busy night, when a repair should have come, nothing. The week when a new title should have arrived, delays. The month when a permit renewal should have sailed through, questions. The pressure felt ordinary until you saw the pattern. That is how he kept the city's coin machine trade aligned for years. With routine turned into leverage, courtesy turned into command. He learned which bars made their nut on third one-shift paydays, which lanes drew bowlers past midnight, which supper clubs lived on Saturday crowds. Routes were built on those rhythms. He rewarded owners who stayed inside his system with quick service, fair counts, and attention to small fixes that matter more than most outsiders realize. A jukebox that fails during a birthday can lose a regular for months. A pinball coil that burns out on league night, same result. He made sure the rooms that cooperated stayed smooth. That was the carrot. The stick was quieter but real. Interruptions that never looked like punishment, if you glanced at them, one at a time. He kept bookmaking in similar shape. Bettors who had earned credit got it on clear terms. Schedules for settling debts were steady. Collectors arrived when they said they would. If someone fell behind, the first talk sounded like advice, the second like a reminder, the third like certainty. By then, most people did not need it spelled out. That is what prosecutors later showed jurors. A system that did not need drama to maintain control. It ran on predictability and the weight of unspoken consequences. He wanted his people to look like staff, not muscle. Collars crisp, shoes polished, low voices. They carried notebooks and used names sparingly. Conversations were a string of cues and responses. Friends, routes, arrangements, proper way. Phrases that meant more to the men at the table than they might to a passerby. When agents finally brought tapes to court, they did not rely on a single dramatic statement. They played the cadence of a world in which those phrases, matched to what happened next in the city's bars and back offices, left little doubt about who was setting terms. Family sat at the center of his method. Marriage into the Aliotto line gave him standing. A father-in-law, who had run the town, passed him the reins without a public speech. His own sons, trained for the professional world, he used as a shield. They kept tidy offices, argued motions, drafted deals, and offered the appearance of legitimate counsel to business owners who had learned that a letter on lawyer's paper moved things along. When the extortion case came, the government said the law office was not just a defense, it was part of the machine. Jurors agreed. Convictions erased bar cards and shortened careers that had begun with promise. The impact ran beyond sentences. It closed a door that had long connected private influence to public respectability. He built ties beyond Milwaukee, the way he built ties at home, slowly, with deference to older lines of authority. Chicago's outfit had layered the region's underworld since Prohibition. Tribute moved south. Support and decisions moved back north when matters needed weight. That relationship let him police his streets with confidence. It also linked him to larger ventures. When Nevada's casinos expanded on Teamsters-backed loans and corporate fronts, Midwestern leaders found ways to steer management and accounting without standing on casino floors. Skimming cash lifted before it reached the count became a quiet revenue stream. Federal agents in the Midwest and Nevada mapped that stream with wiretaps, ledgers, and witnesses. His name ended up in that file, and in the mid-1980 seconds he pleaded guilty to charges tied to the diversion of casino money. The plea avoided a trial that would have replayed months of recorded calls about managers, shares, and deliveries, but it fixed the point in the public record. He had a role in that scheme. Milwaukee changed under his watch and after it. During his prime, people accepted the cost of his order because bars stayed calm and service trucks showed up even in snow. After his fall, the same businesses learned to live with inspectors, bids, and contracts that could be read aloud in a hearing. The state lottery drew small wagers out of back rooms. Tribal casinos offered legal play. Vendors professionalized, learned to win placements without quiet threats, and built service departments that could prove response times with work orders instead of favors. That transition did not happen in a single winter. It took years of owners comparing notes, of regulators applying pressure, of prosecutors showing that a polite phrase can count as coercion when everyone knows what sits behind it. He understood local politics at the ground level. Who signed off on entertainment licenses, who scheduled inspections, who interpreted occupancy rules with tighter or looser standards. He cultivated those relationships with donations, dinner tickets, and a reputation for solving problems. He never had to say, "Do this," on the record. A call couched as concern could be enough to slow something here and nudge something there. In court, the government translated those nudges into evidence by laying recorded hints alongside the outcomes that followed. That is how a suggestion turned into proof of pressure. The 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds left scars that people still mention quietly. Several bombings and attempted bombings rocked Milwaukee during disputes tied by investigators to the machine trade cars charred in driveways, storefronts damaged, the fronts of bars torn at dawn. Reporters and police often suspected organized crime figures were behind the attacks. His name came up because order under his rule benefited when rivals grew cautious. He denied involvement, and no court convicted him for those explosions. That history belongs in the record with care. Suspicion is not guilt. The climate those acts produced is also part of the truth. Fear travels farther than proof. A few blasts can convince 100 owners to avoid trouble. He built a habit of meeting in rooms where clatter disguised microphones, dining rooms, coffee shops with constant steam, parking lots near traffic. He preferred to face the door. He kept talks short, moved locations when a place felt off, and rotated restaurants often enough that agents had to hustle to keep up. They did. They sat with cold coffee, waited outside in rain, learned his signals, and placed devices under court orders where they would catch more than rumor. The tapes that resulted were not cinematic. They were patient. When prosecutors paired them with ledgers and calendars, jurors could see how a word on Tuesday aligned with a skipped delivery on Friday. That is what modern cases require. Structure over spectacle. His years inside federal prisons did not turn him into a commentator. He stayed disciplined, wrote letters, kept routines, and left public conversation to others. He did not sell a memoir. He did not seek interviews. Friends who visited recall ordinary talk: family, food, the weather back home, reminders about keeping steady. He came out older and quieter. The command structure that had answered to him for decades no longer existed in the same way. Even men who had admired his order understood that the ground had moved. He accepted the smaller life and spent his last years among family, with occasional lunches where the staff knew his habits and where no one paused the room when he arrived. The effect of his fall rippled through the Midwest. Chicago's own leadership faced convictions tied to the Vegas skim. Kansas City figures went down on recorded calls that described discipline and shares. Cleveland's lines, too, were drawn in court. That network, once held together by shared interests and silence, learned that coordination can cut both ways. When one city's case went to trial, another city's tapes might be queued up. His plea placed Milwaukee in that chain, an acknowledgement that the city was not an island but part of a regional system that had funneled money from casinos to bosses far from Nevada. The extortion case at home turned into a teaching tool. The appellate decision that upheld the verdicts explained fear of economic loss in clear language. When a business owner signs because he believes refusing will bring targeted harm, late service, unusual inspections, blocked deliveries, the law recognizes that fear as extortion under the Hobbs Act, so long as interstate commerce is touched. Law schools still point to that opinion when they teach how white-collar coercion operates. Investigators still use its logic when they explain to juries that a voice like his does not need to threaten violence to cross the line. He remains, for many in Milwaukee, a symbol of a particular trade-off. Some older owners will tell you the streets were calmer, that fights got handled before they spilled into headlines. Others answer that calm was built on a tax they paid in silence, a share of their revenue, the loss of choice in who serviced their rooms, the stress of knowing a wrong decision could bring a tide of small troubles. Both memories can be true at once. Cities hold contradictions like that for a long time. What the record adds is accountability. He was convicted of federal extortion charges. He pleaded guilty in a case tied to casino skimming. He served years. Those are facts, not rumors told after last call. His path from neighborhood kid to the figure agents labeled Mr. Big runs through institutions that shape the Midwest. Parishes, clubs, union halls, taverns, small banks, and family dinners that doubled as planning sessions. It also runs through changes he could not control. The spread of wiretaps under judicial supervision, statutory tools that let prosecutors connect related acts, and a media culture that grew more comfortable describing local organized crime without euphemism. He played the long game and still got caught, because the game itself changed. You can see his imprint in the industries he touched. The vending and amusement trade in Milwaukee looks more corporate now, with technicians logging work orders in apps and contracts reviewed under bright lights. Sports betting has entered legal channels in many places, tracked by accounts instead of notebooks. Loans are more likely to come from banks that file forms than from collectors who file memories. That is not to say the old ways vanished entirely. Human nature enjoys shortcuts. But the space for a single, soft-spoken man to bend a city's habits to his will has narrowed. He died in 1993, and the city absorbed the news with little drama. People read that the reputed boss had passed, that he had been convicted in the 1,980 seconds on extortion counts, that he had acknowledged his role in a Las Vegas skim case, that he spent much of that decade in federal custody. Friends recalled steady manners. Former rivals remembered steady pressure. Reporters wrote balanced pieces that fit him into Milwaukee's civic archive. The story faded from the front page and settled into bookshelves, lectures, and conversations between generations of owners comparing then and now. What he leaves behind for anyone who cares to study it is a set of lessons about how power hides. It lives in routines, in helpful calls, in contracts signed after a pause, in favors that feel like gifts until the due date arrives. It also leaves a map of how institutions respond when they learn to listen more than look. Agents followed patterns. Prosecutors built timelines. Courts wrote opinions that put plain words to careful conduct. The outcome was never a single moment. It was a long accumulation of small truths that, together, weighed more than one man's poise. He once believed that control meant never being surprised at a table. The surprise came from elsewhere. Not a rival with a bigger entourage, but a world that replaced whispers with recordings and replaced deference with rules. He lived long enough to see that shift, and he adjusted as much as an old habit allows. He did not try to turn back the clock. He finished his days with the composure that had always marked him, even when composure could no longer move the room. Walk through the neighborhoods where he worked, and you still find traces only if you know where to look. A bar with a photo of a long-gone softball team sponsored by a machine company that used to answer to his calls. An older owner who checks the door reflexively because some habits never leave. A young manager who learned the history and decided to keep every contract clean. That is the legacy that matters most. Not the nickname or the mythology. It is a city that learned to run itself more in daylight, with fewer quiet taxes and more visible rules. Because for a long time, one man proved how easily the opposite can be done. The end of his life unfolded in a low register, but the echoes of what he built kept moving through Milwaukee like a current under the ice. He had spent decades turning city habits into a kind of private gravity. When that gravity finally loosened, the space it left behind filled with a new way of doing things. Inspectors with checklists, instead of arrangers with advice. Bids read in public instead of contracts pushed across a table with a nod. That shift did not erase him. It set the measure for how deep his reach had been. People looked at the ordinary details when a service truck arrived, how a permit moved, who placed a machine in a busy room, and realized how long the answers to those questions had been scripted elsewhere. He never liked to give speeches. He preferred small rooms, controlled settings, and conversations that ended with agreement. That rhythm stayed with him until the last. After prison, he stuck to family, to old friends, to restaurants that still knew his taste in fish and coffee. He moved through those rooms without the pause that used to ripple when he entered. The mystique had been drained by transcripts and exhibits, yet staff still set aside a corner table because old habits die slowly in a city that respects its regulars. He was polite, careful, and smaller in ambition. The long game had been played. Now came the quiet. People asked what exactly he had done, beyond the shorthand of boss. The answer lives in the case files and FBI summaries. He arranged illegal gambling and booked bets through a network of collectors. He extended high-interest credit to keep bettors in the game. He directed and profited from extortion that leaned on fear of business disruption. He dominated the coin machine and vending routes through pressure, dressed as customer service. He participated in the diversion of casino money in the Las Vegas skim era. He cultivated influence that steered contracts and inspections. And he used coded language and layers of intermediaries to keep his fingerprints off outcomes for as long as possible. Those were the crimes he was charged with, convicted of, or admitted to in court. They were not rumors. They were proven with recordings, witnesses, ledgers, and pleas. The way he handled gambling showed how sophisticated a simple idea can become. A book is a promise to settle later. Multiply that promise across a city full of fans and paycheck cycles, add credit, and you have a system that depends on trust until it doesn't. When bettors fell behind, he did not allow chaos. He insisted on steady collections that kept money moving without attracting attention. Interest piled up. Debtors returned for more credit because the same network that tightened the knot also offered the only immediate relief. Federal descriptions of his circle used words like loan sharking and collection, not as labels of a movie stereotype, but as a legal description of how a business runs when fear stands behind the terms. It was profitable because people like predictability. He sold predictability at a price. The coin machine trade made that price part of everyday life. A jukebox felt like a harmless joy, a machine that changed the mood of a room. Control the placement of those machines, and you control cash flow tied to tavern culture itself. He made service reliability his calling card. If you stayed within the system, someone answered your call and showed up with a toolbox before the dinner rush. If you didn't, the world developed friction. Deliveries slowed, repairmen found other work to do, and a bar could feel slightly out of tune for weeks. He didn't have to remove a machine to show a point. He only had to make it harder to run a business that depends on music and glow. The federal case against him made that logic visible to jurors. The Seventh Circuit's opinion affirmed that fear of those accumulated harms can be extortion under the Hobbs Act when interstate commerce is touched by the machines, parts, and money that move across state lines. The tapes that captured his method remain some of the clearest windows into how he ruled. Agents didn't rely on chance. They studied his routines, where he liked to sit, how he preferred to face the door, which restaurants muffled sound with clatter, and placed microphones under court order in the places where he felt most at home. The recordings do not deliver fireworks. They deliver a cadence, a man who talks in plain suggestions that everyone at the table knows are instructions, a code that rests on shared history. When those phrases line up with what happens next in the city, a delivery skipped, a service call delayed, a reluctant owner calling to say he'll sign after all jurors can hear command expressed through courtesy. That was the essence of the case, showing people who had never met him how power sounds when it wants to be mistaken for advice. His connection to Las Vegas put him on a larger map. The skim era did not need him pacing a casino floor. It needed understanding among men who shaped management from behind the curtain. Counting rooms in certain hotels bled cash that never met the ledger. The pipeline ran through trusted intermediaries linked to Midwestern organizations and federal investigations. Operation Strawman and related cases revealed the route in transcripts and testimony. He chose to plead guilty rather than fight at trial in Nevada, a decision that acknowledged the weight of the recordings and left no doubt in the public record that Milwaukee's leader had a place in the scheme. That plea added time to his prison term and cemented a national legacy. Not only the boss of a lakeshore city, but a participant in a multi-state enterprise that treated a casino like a farm to be harvested in secret. People often think of bribery when they imagine that world, but his influence looked different. It lived in favors, a timely phone call, a suggestion that a permit should be revisited, an introduction that put the right person with the right banker. Those gestures are hard to prosecute until a long pattern emerges, and by then the pressure looks like policy because so many people have accepted it for so many years. The shift away from that kind of influence is why his fall felt both sudden and overdue. Once tapes and ledgers established a pattern, the conduct lost its camouflage. There were darker notes in the background. During route wars in the 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds, Milwaukee suffered a series of bombings and attempted bombings outside bars, homes, and cars, tied to machine disputes. Authorities suspected organized crime involvement. His name surfaced because consolidating fear served his interests. He denied involvement, and he was not convicted in any bombing case. That distinction matters in any honest account. So does the climate those blasts created. They stood as wordless demonstrations of what defiance could bring, magnifying the effect of quieter pressures and making it easier for him to keep roots aligned without constant confrontation. Family remained both shield and sore point. Marriage into the Alioto family gave him standing. Bringing his sons into the legal side of his world offered the appearance of legitimate counsel that could smooth meetings and send letters instead of collectors. When the extortion case named father and sons together, the cost was catastrophic. Convictions removed law licenses and recast promising careers as extensions of a coercive scheme. The family dinners that had once doubled as planning sessions turned into consultations about appeals and visitation schedules. Even people who disliked him felt the human weight of that collapse. It showed how deeply he had braided family and business, and how painful it can be when the law cuts that braid apart. What he built lasted because it told people a simple story. Stay in line, and the world will run on time. Step outside, and you'll feel resistance. The same story exists in legitimate forms all over the world. Contracts with incentives, warranties that reward loyalty, penalties for early cancellation. He took that logic and added fear where a normal business adds discounts. That is why the tapes sound almost mundane. The words are neighborly. The effect is not. Once you learn to hear the difference, you cannot unhear it. That was the FBI's skill in presenting the case. Teaching jurors to listen for the weight inside the tone. After he died in 1993, the city folded his name into a shelf of local history, crime reporting, academic studies, oral histories from tavern owners and route men who remembered the old way. His nickname, Mr. Big, lost its menace and became a tag in headlines. The facts stayed fixed. Born in 1918 to an Italian neighborhood, married into the prior leadership, ascended to control illegal gambling, loans, and the machine trade. Ruled quietly for decades, targeted by the FBI with wiretaps and patient surveillance. Convicted in federal court on extortion charges alongside his sons. Pleaded guilty in a case tied to Las Vegas skimming. Served years in prison. Returned older and quieter. Died without a comeback. Those points define the arc. The longer resonance has less to do with him than with the city that adapted to life after him. Milwaukee's vending and amusement business became more competitive and transparent, with paperwork that could withstand audits. Gambling found legal channels that drew wagers out of back rooms. Regulators and prosecutors learned how to describe white-collar coercion in ways that ordinary citizens could grasp, using his case as a template. Law schools folded the appellate decision into teaching materials on the Hobbs Act. Journalists stopped treating organized crime as a set of coy euphemisms and reported the systems as they were. Owners found their voices because they had something they lacked before: confidence that calling a lawyer would produce help, not more trouble. It helps to remember that none of those changes happened overnight. They were the product of a long conversation between institutions and citizens. Agents sat in cars and learned to map routines. Prosecutors urged judges to approve tools that matched law to reality. Juries listened to hours of tape about everyday acts and understood how those acts fit together. Owners who had swallowed pressure for years risked testifying. Appeals courts took the experience of one city and turned it into language any court could use. That is the civic machinery working as intended. It doesn't need a hero. It needs patience and a willingness to see through polish. What remains of him in Milwaukee now are small signs. A photograph on a tavern wall from a card tournament that a long-gone machine company sponsored. An older owner who pauses before signing any exclusive agreement because history taught him to read the fine print. A former route man who still keeps his shoes shined because the boss expected it. A prosecutor who plays a clip from the case to a new class of agents and says, Listen to how control can sound like politeness. Those fragments carry the past forward in useful ways. They teach caution without glamour. He would have understood that utility. He saw the world as a series of systems to be managed. In the end, his own life became a system other people studied to make the city run better. There is a symmetry in that. He once believed the point of power was to make sure nothing surprised him at a table. The surprise came from outside the room, a world that learned to record what used to pass only in whispers and to treat quiet pressure as a matter for open court. He adapted as far as habit allowed, accepted smaller circles, and left quietly. His story resists a clean moral because it contains more than one truth. He brought order to certain corners that might otherwise have fallen into chaos. He did it by breaking laws and extracting payments from people who felt they couldn't refuse. He invested in community events and used that goodwill to grease deals. He kept streets calmer by narrowing choices. He dressed his methods in courtesy, and for a long time, courtesy was enough to keep him safe. Then a set of tools, wiretaps under court supervision, racketeering statutes, coordinated prosecutions that crossed state lines made method into evidence. That is how a careful man gets caught. The city didn't build a statue to mark his passing. It didn't need one. The legacy is written in how contracts are handled, how bids are posted, how regulators insist on daylight. It's written in the memory of owners who once paid a silent tax for peace and now prefer rules they can read. It's written in lessons passed from agents to younger colleagues about how to follow routines until they confess their secrets. And it's written in the absence of a single name that makes rooms go quiet. That absence is a kind of freedom. If you listen to people who knew him, you hear the same closing note. He was composed. He was exacting. He believed in order, and he could be generous when generosity served the order he wanted. He also kept a ledger that always pointed uphill toward his chair. The record verdicts, pleas, opinions tells that part without sentiment. Together, memory and record give a full picture. A man who turned everyday habits into private authority and who met the end of that authority in a courtroom where his voice, stripped of mystique, sounded like what it was. And the city? It kept on. Snow fell. The lake threw light on brick. Taverns filled after games. Machines blinked with new software instead of coins, and their service calls were logged in databases instead of notebooks. People still argued about music on a Friday night, but no one had to call a fixer before swapping a machine. That quiet difference is the measure of how far Milwaukee traveled from the years when one man could set the rhythm of a neighborhood with a phone call. It is also the simplest proof that his time has ended. The beat belongs to the rooms again. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story from the Silent Empires. Frank Balistrieri here, thanking you for joining me on this quiet reflection of leadership, patience, and control. If this story helped you unwind tonight, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and join our family for more stories of gangsters and forgotten empires. Over 90% of our viewers watch but haven't subscribed yet, so if you enjoyed this one, your support truly helps us keep bringing more powerful stories to life. Share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where these stories reach. Until next time, may the silence of the empire rest over you, and may the echoes of history carry you gently into sleep. Good night.